Welcome to Billy's Books. This is a big deal. We're going to review the new Beatles book, The Get Back, in anticipation of the soon-to-be released on Disney Plus, the multi-hour documentary by Peter Jsckson about the same project. And this is the book to go with it, along with the album and everything. The Beatles really know how to market. They're good at that. So this book is, it's a coffee table book with lots of pretty pictures. I'm just going to open the one page, see what pretty pictures are there. Okay, this is a pretty pictures page. Maybe not the best, but anyway. How about this one next door? So the majority there's an introduction that puts by some people that puts this into context, but the majority of the book is dialogue. That was since, in case you don't know, the original movie Let It Be came out in 1970, and it documented the Beatles breaking up. And no, isn't that sad? It was sad. And the documentary showed them as kind of an acrimonious band crumbling, and it's a depressing thing to watch your favorite band sort of argue and bicker, and Peter Jsckson was given access to them, and he's released a new thing. And turns out, even though the original Let It Be movie was depressing, there's tons and tons of joy in all that footage. And so they're going to put, this new one's going to show a lot more joy. Anyway, this is, once again, the dialogue on here. It's mostly dialogue, the people just recording a transcription of the conversations that happened on all this footage. The idea is to document the Beatles learning songs, rehearsing songs, and then performing them. And for a while, they had some pretty extravagant ideas about where those performances would be: North Africa, Mount Everest, etc. Get in an ocean liner and with a bunch of fans and do it together, and all these things, with different reactions by different members of the band, how enthusiastic they are. George and Ringo are much less into it than Paul and John. George is like, we're going to be stuck on a boat for 2 weeks with these people? No. I'd rather go on vacation after doing the show right here in England. And Ringo flip-flops. And Paul's just like, can we just decide? Just decide. And early on, Paul talks about how he's like, yes, he's been sort of the boss for a long time, or being bossy, not because he wants to, but because nobody else is acting, and he's obviously got a wicked work ethic. It's not like, oh, John wants to leave and all that stuff. John's actually still pretty enthusiastic, according to the conversations in here about being a Beatle. It's really George who's unhappy, and it makes sense that George would be unhappy. Part of the Beatles breakup is that George was, getting the short shrift while Paul and John did all their songs. Even when George would have a good song, they'd still spend much more time on Maxwell's Silver Hammer or something like that. And so it seemed really unfair to George, and he complains about it. And I'm going to read you one conversation that happens early on. I'm just going to read it back to you. I'm tempted to do accents, but I'm not going to. Really, I don't want to do any of my songs on the show, because I know they'll just turn out shitty, because they'd come out like a compromise. Whereas in a studio, then we can work on them and get it how you want them. Paul responds, but look, George, last year you were telling me that you can do anything you want, Paul. Anything you desire, you can do, George says, yeah. And Paul says, but these days you're saying before the show is finished and before we've done it, we're not going to be able to do it, They're going to come out a compromise. Now, I don't think that. I really don't. I really think that we're very good. And we can get it together if we think that we want to do these songs great. We can just do it great, But thinking it's not going to come out great won't help. So Paul's saying, don't be such a negative nanny. That's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Also, while they're planning, it's really interesting because Yoko's there for a lot of the talk, of course, which is she's another scapegoat for breakup. But what's interesting is the acrimony. Yoko is generally quite pleasant the whole time, and in fact, while they're trying to figure out she's a performance artist first and foremost, so that's something to be aware of. So they're talking about different performances, and one of the ideas that comes up is just playing to a big space, maybe an outdoor festival with a whole bunch of empty chairs, and as they go through it, Paul and Yoko, who are reputed to be always arguing or not getting along very well, they pretty much agree on everything. Other people are complaining, but they're always together and saying, no, this is a good thing. Paul emphasizes that he had to take over because when Brian Epstein died, there's no leadership, and they were just a boat without a keel. So he tried to provide that, but he's getting sick of it. Not just because it's draining emotionally to be the one person doing everything, but that there was so much resistance. And he's like, and after a while, he's like, well, if you guys really don't want to do it, maybe we should stop. But he doesn't want to. He's just like, decide, decide, decide. But the real friction is between Paul and George in most of these conversations. And what's interesting is John is the peacemaker during all of this. He often provides, sort of little interjections that are supposed to either make it funny or, they're all, the thing about this is that I think we're going to see in the documentary is that even when they're having these serious discussions on paper, it looks really serious. But when you see them talking in person, they're smiling and they're saying these things with a smile on their face, and you can tell there's still a bit of affection between friends. So it's just friends disagreeing most of the time. But for George, it's been accumulating over the years. He's like, it isn't just that he gets less songs, but it's like each of his songs gets less rehearsal time. Meanwhile, the director, Michael Lindsay Hogg, an American, who's a little chubby, and I think John keeps making fun of him. I don't think John respects the director all that much, because he kind of, at least on paper, he's mocking him a lot. He calls him chunky. He imitates his American accent, and he kind of says shoot down things, which is standard for someone like John Lennon. Anyway, so they're talking about, so Michael's trying to say, no, this has got to be an entertaining movie, and it's Paul, there's certain basic things we've just got to do if we're going to do it. As far as I can see it, there's only two ways, and that's what I was shouting about in the last meeting we had. We're going to do it, or we're not going to do it. And I want a decision, because I'm not interested enough to witheringly spend my fucking days farting around here while everyone makes up their minds whether they want to do it, I'll do it. If everyone else will, and everyone wants to do it, then all right. But, if it's just a bit soft, it's like at school, you've got to be here, and I haven't, I've left school. We've all left school, and you don't have to go. What he's saying is, he's kind of saying, man up, We don't have Brian Epstein to tell us what to do like a school teacher. If he says, no one's going to tell us to get up in the morning. We have to decide to get up in the morning. It's up to us to do that ourselves. So stop being such a child, or stop being such children. That's his next message. Poor Paul. Poor, dear, rich, talented Paul. One of the things that the director and some of the other characters in the entourage are reminding them is that how important the Beatles are to their fans and to the world. And so this TV show or documentary they're making with the performance is something the world needs to see because the Beatles are so important. And I imagine that doesn't help the situation at all. It just adds more pressure, and people like George in particular really resent that kind of pressure to do the right thing, pressure from the public. This is way going off the book here. Right after George died in 2001, he died of lung cancer from smoking his whole life, And somebody I knew, she said, it would have been responsible of him to speak to the world about the dangers of lung cancer and don't do what I did. And I thought to myself, boy, you don't really know George Harrison's personality very well, because that's the last thing he would do. If he were an American, he would be a libertarian. Speaking of George, suddenly, unceremoniously, quite casually, he quits, just walks out right in the middle of the day. And then they're like, what do we do now? And John's like, and he quits on a Friday. And they're in a movie set, a movie studio, they're actually working days, which is also unnatural and adding to their unhappiness. So they quits on a Friday, and John says, all right, well, that's a problem, but not that big a problem, because he's kind of annoying. He's been getting on my nerves lately. Let's give him till Tuesday. If he doesn't come back till Tuesday, let's get Eric Clapton, which is so harsh. But many of you have heard that story. Part of the rumor is, John was unhappy and he wanted to quit the Beatles anyway. Not at this point. He says, if George leaves, do we want to carry on with the Beatles? I do. So it's just right in there in black and white. That's what he said. They reunite on Monday morning, and George still isn't back, and John and Yoko are late. Ta-da! So it's Paul and George and the director and a whole bunch of other people in an entourage, including Yoko and Linda, are all sitting in a big circle talking about, first of all, they're talking about John and Yoko and how weird it is that Yoko is everywhere all the time, always by her side, always by John's side, and kind of getting in the way. Once again, the big breakup. Guess who comes to Yoko's defense? Paul. Paul comes to Yoko's defense. He comes to both of their defense. He says they're in love. They're absolutely in love, and they can't be apart. That's just how they are. And don't make John choose. You can't make him choose, because if he chooses, he's going to choose her, not us. So we just have to let her stay. The whole group in general is discussing how she has a lot to say, even though she's not a Beatle. And it's like, well, she is an artist, but she interjects herself into the conversation more than these other guys might like. But at one point, Paul says, yeah, well, when we were trying to work on this particular song, I forgot which one, she was still in the room, but she pulled back, She gave us space to write. So that whole Paul versus Yoko thing is really outdone. Nobody broke up the Beatles but the Beatles. So the question about who broke up the Beatles, I got more to say about that. I do. The cheap excuse from the people who don't know what they're talking about is Yoko Ono. It's a nice racist, sexist thing to do, to blame someone external for the internal strife of the Beatles. Some say Paul McCartney, just because during the 70s it was the other three versus Paul in all the lawsuits. That is related to what I'm about to say. But another interesting candidate would be George Harrison, because his dissatisfaction in these times really kind of stirred the pot and sort of set things in motion for the future breakup. But I'm not going to blame George Harrison either. You know who I'm going to blame? Alan Klein. Who is Alan Klein, you say? Well, Alan Klein was a candidate for management of the Beatles in the absence of Brian Epstein. And John, George, and Ringo all wanted Alan Klein, but Paul was like, why don't we use my father-in-law, John Eastman, instead? And the other three were like, oh, that doesn't sound like that'll be fair. He'll always favor you. But Paul was like, but Alan Klein's a crook! And they're like, and they went back and forth like that for years. They spent years and years and years just suing each other over that stuff. Turns out that Paul was right. Alan Klein was a crook. To get back to the peacemaker thing that John is good at one point, while they're talking about what to do about the absence of George, John actually says a lot. And it's interesting how his communication style is quite different from Paul's. When he's not, sardonically insulting people, he's actually very wise and constructive. And so he says, they're talking about, how unhappy George is. It's not just that George gets less material, but he gets kind of bossed around by Paul, because Paul's so bossy, because he often has a full image of a song in his head, and like the whole arrangement sometimes. And there's even some scenes in Let It Be, and I'm assuming in the new documentary, where they spend a lot of time on I've Got a Feeling, where there's like a break where the guitars are supposed to go right, and of course that's George's job, and so Paul's like over and over again, and George is trying to play this descending bend over, and Paul's like, no, not quite, and it goes on for a long time, and so John is saying in the middle of all this, I never tell George what to play. And the implication, because John, they're British and all, so you have to read between the lines with John. He's kind of telling Paul, you got to let George make up his own parts, because earlier on they're always talking about practicing and stuff, and how, because earlier on there, Paul's like, don't play so busy. And George is like, I'm not playing busy, I'm just trying to figure stuff out. Like you're trying to figure stuff out. And it goes back and forth like that. Once they're in the Apple building, they really it's like a little family environment, and everyone's so nice to each other. It's pretty beautiful. And George and John, I think, both want to get a song to a certain point and record it and then do the next one. Whereas Paul's like, let's get up a big show so we can play a big live show. That's sort of where the difference between them are. This book is just absolutely filled with cool pictures and very interesting dialogue. I'm talking about the problems they're having, but it's a lot of it is just joking around, and they're so freaking clever. These guys they're all four of them. It's like, oh, Ringo's a dumb guy. Ringo's not dumb. He's just down to earth. he comes up with some pretty clever quips himself, you know, and they're all very smart and very nice to each other. We also learn a little bit more about Billy Preston, and he's my favorite of all the fifth Beatles. Anyway, so love this book, love the Beatles. What you can't do, review.